Welcome to Resistance Live. Since 2017, Resistance Live has been the go-to home for political and legal news and analysis through a decidedly progressive activist lens. I'm your host, Elizabeth Cronise McLaughlin. I'm a former Wall Street and human rights lawyer, a lifelong organizer, and a leadership and impact consultant for all those seeking to lead big progressive change in these incredibly challenging times. To get bonus broadcasts, ask questions, and more, don't forget to become a paid subscriber to the show at patreon.com/resistancelive. And to learn more about what we do to help progressive leaders everywhere, check out GaiaLeadershipProject.com. And now, here's today's show. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the show. It's the 29th of December, 2025. I hope you all had a good beginning part of your holiday break. Mine was not at all relaxing. I'm so exhausted, you guys. I can't even tell you. So we are taking, just a quick reminder, we will be here tomorrow, but we are taking off the rest of the week for the New Year's holiday, which is why we're doing a bonus broadcast on Mondays when we're not normally here. Okay, there were a mountain of questions this morning on the Patreon feed. The vast bulk of them have to do with Epstein. There were some comments that came in at the last minute, by the way, which is really hard for me to get to. So try to get your questions in early because I'm not going to be able to get to the ones that came in the last 5 minutes. But I'm going to do my best to get to the ones that came in about Epstein in the last 3 hours because they're significant. Okay, so the biggest breaking news in the last week was that, of course, we had a document dump from the DOJ last week that had some really significant revelations in it. One was that in 2019, when Trump was in office the first time, the DOJ was investigating 10 potential co-conspirators of Epstein's. Now, we know very little from the document so far about who they are, but there's at least one decent guest. One of the co-conspirators is referred to as a wealthy man from Ohio. That has to be Les Wexner, the founder of Victoria's Secret. There's really kind of nobody else who would be wrapped into that. But there are other subpoenas that were served in Boston, New York City, and Florida. We do not know who was attached to those. And one of the things that I want everybody to keep in mind here is that when we're talking about co-conspirators, we are probably talking about sex trafficking, meaning the transportation of these girls across state lines for illicit purposes. So that means essentially anybody who paid for that, procured a jet for that, participated in it is potentially a co-conspirator. We do not know who that is. Now, somebody asked a question on the Patreon feed about why these individuals would have been subpoenaed, given that they have a Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, which of course everybody has inside the United States if you happen, or you're supposed to at least, if you are detained or arrested. The fact that you have a Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination is not a preclusion from being subpoenaed, nor is it a preclusion from being prosecuted. And so the question that I was asked was, well, would they have been subpoenaed if they weren't planning on charging them? No, subpoenas are a usual part of the investigatory process. And so if you are potentially subject to investigation as a co-conspirator of Epstein, you should actually expect that you're going to get a subpoena for documents, for materials, maybe for your computer, and the like. And that also allows, by the way, the FBI can seek warrants to execute search warrants and the like, of your premises, of your documents, of your computer files, your search history, any number of other things, right? So the fact that they were subpoenaed essentially means nothing in the context of the DOJ's decision on whether or not to prosecute. And one of the things that I just want to remind everybody of here, because I've heard a lot in the last few days from people who don't understand this process about, how could the Biden DOJ have sat on these materials? Why would they have done that? Well, in a normally functioning DOJ, when there is an ongoing investigation, there is no public comment concerning that investigation. So assuming, as we now know, that in late 2019, there was an investigation into 10 co-conspirators, that I have to remind everybody here, DOJ investigations ordinarily take a very long period of time. We would have expected the Biden DOJ, which, by the way, would have had lifers because Biden didn't go about firing everybody the way that Trump has done, we would have expected that DOJ to continue the investigation. And if that investigation was ongoing over several years, we would not have expected any comment. We certainly would not have expected a release of files. And one of the things that I have to remind everybody of here, for anybody who has a critique of Merrick Garland, I just want to remind you that this is the way that DOJ has historically worked in every circumstance. They are not supposed to be politicized. They are not supposed to release information for political purposes, right? What Trump is doing is actually incredibly out of the ordinary. This is not the way the DOJ has ever historically functioned. And so one thing I want to remind everybody of also is that the DOJ has guidebooks that essentially direct the U.S. attorneys and their staff in what they can and cannot do with regard to particular investigations. So nobody at this point, whatever your frustrations are with Merrick Garland, should be lashing out about the fact that the Biden DOJ didn't release anything due to an ongoing investigation. That, in fact, is standard operating procedure under the normal functionality of a DOJ. Again, this is a moment where I have to remind you all, those of you who have been here for a while have heard me say this many, many times, that back when President Obama took office, as an example of this, he gave a speech to all of the U.S. attorneys in the country where he said to them, "You do not work for me. You work for the American people. And whatever your determinations are with regard to investigation and prosecution should be driven by that." Now, I'm paraphrasing this, but that's essentially what he said. He basically instructed the DOJ, as any normal president believing in democracy would do, that they were not there to do his political bidding. And so one of the things that I just want people to remember here is that it's not as though the Biden DOJ did anything wrong in this instance. They, in fact, were following protocol and procedure. Now, while I understand that people may be very frustrated about this, right? There are good reasons for this. There's actually legal and policy-based reasons for not releasing files of people under investigation. Because apart from anything else, there is a long-standing legal policy position, like just, you get taught this your first year of law school, that you don't want people who may not eventually be charged to potentially be implicated. This is why we have innocent until proven guilty, right? We don't want people who may never be charged, who may not have committed a crime, to potentially be implicated in something through the release of materials while an investigation is still ongoing, all right? Like, innocent until proven guilty is something that has driven the DOJ and frankly our entire Justice Department and entire justice system from the jump. It hasn't always worked that way as it should. Don't get me wrong. You all know I have wide-ranging critiques of our judicial system. But all that said, it's not like they were doing anything wrong. All right. And again, this is something that people really have to wrap their heads around. I'm not going to claim that the DOJ has been perfect. Certainly not. We have plenty of indications from historical events that they have done things that are really, really questionable, sometimes illegal. But in this instance, it's totally understandable that the Biden DOJ sat on these files. So I want everybody to kind of move in the direction of understanding this, okay? Now, all that said, I do want to also mention one other thing that came out of this most recent release that is really disturbing. Julie K. Brown, who many of you know is an investigative reporter at the Miami Herald, has been writing on Epstein literally for more than a decade. And she is the person who actually originally broke the story about Alex Acosta's sweetheart deal with Epstein back in the aughts that eventually led to Alex Acosta being ousted as Trump's initial labor chair in his first administration. So turns out that based on these files released from the DOJ under Trump 1 was tracking the travel plans of Julie Brown. In fact, there are travel records in there that apparently are under her maiden name. She herself disclosed this on I think on X, and potentially on Blue Sky, to the effect that those were her travel records. Why are they in the DOJ's release about Epstein? So again, this is a sign of what Trump was doing even in the first administration, that essentially the DOJ was tracking a journalist whose reporting they didn't find favorable and monitoring her whereabouts and her travel habits. It's very disturbing stuff. I don't know what's going to come out of that, but it is something else that has recently come out in this release. Okay, last thing I want to mention here on the Epstein front, well, not the last thing, because somebody asked me a broader question, but the last thing from a facts and a news-based standpoint is that we did have an announcement from the DOJ middle of last week that they had, quote unquote, found 1 million new pages of documents at the Southern District of New York U.S. Attorney's Office, and it was going to take them a few more weeks to release them. So I just have to point something out, all right, about this. couple things that are relevant to everybody here, okay? One of the things that I want people to grasp, okay, is that Trump took over the DOJ almost a year ago, and all of those files were immediately transferred to the DOJ headquarters, DOJ main justice in Washington, D.C. when Trump took over. So the idea that there were somehow 1 million pages being stored at the Southern District of New York in some format, not paper, again, we've talked about this many, many times, is false. Like, it isn't like there was some magical file cabinet that was storing 1 million pages of documents that the DOJ main did not have access to, okay? So this whole thing smells really funny, but let me just add one other thing here. What a lot of people may not understand is that when you are conducting a normal document review, like let's just say you represent a company and that company is sued and you receive in discovery document requests for electronic files and materials or documents that you may have in your possession that are relevant to the litigation. There are protocols that are designed to be followed here to make sure that you don't miss anything. Searches are conducted in all sorts of ways to determine what electronic files are relevant. Here's the thing that's like bizarre about this, right? Pam Bondi said that the Epstein files were quote unquote on her desk this past spring. Then there was this thing of like the Epstein files don't exist that happened in July. Then in July, we started to see this ramp up to trying to pass the Epstein Files Transparency Act. It's not like they haven't known that this was coming. And so one of the things that also doesn't smell right here is the idea that somehow the DOJ, even the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York, which is known for its independence, and by the way, was where Maureen Comey worked before she was fired, and she was working on the Epstein files. She was still working under Trump until he fired her earlier this year. The idea that they would not have known that there was like 1 million pages of materials hanging out there is just, even on the basis of like standard protocol for document discovery, a total load of horseshit. So again, one of the things that I just want people to be aware of here is that there is an obvious desire to delay. We talked before the break about the fact that they were very clearly also redacting people's identities, their faces, even when they were not in photographs with girls, not in photographs with alleged victims. They were actually taking actions that were designed in express contradiction of the Epstein Files Transparency Act to protect people's reputations. And that is not what they are allowed to do. So I don't know what's going on with these 1 million pages. I guess we're going to find out when they're released. I will already point out that their redaction job has been full of errors. We had situations where, you could literally cut and paste from a redacted document into another document and see what was underneath it, which is also against standard document protocol, where you're supposed to save everything to PDF once it's redacted so that metadata does not live in what you've disclosed. They're clearly not doing everything in the standard way that it should be done. Whether that's incompetence or intent or both is up for debate, okay? But I will just say this. I am anxiously waiting to see what comes next because we've got a lot more files out there that we know at this point. At this point, we know it's at least 1.3 million pages, and we've received somewhere in the range of like tens of thousands. So we have a long way to go on this. Obviously, they are in direct violation. I'm going to remind everybody the last broadcast that we did before the break, we talked about inherent contempt. We talked about the fact that it was possible for the Congress to hold Pam Bondi in contempt. We also talked about judicial contempt, where if an action is started in court to enforce the Epstein Files Transparency Act, people can actually be thrown in jail for not doing what they're supposed to do, and the files can be reviewed in camera, meaning in the judge's chambers, in order to actually have them released. So there's a long way to go here in terms of enforcement. I don't know, man. It's a crazy time. That's all I'm kind of going to say about that. Somebody asked me a broader question, to get to the broader question that I was asked about what happens if Trump essentially quote unquote survives this. All right. So I just have to point something out. Like, I'm not sure what people's expectations were about these files. A couple of the Patreon subscribers, I appreciate you guys, came into the question feed this morning and said, I hung my hopes too high on this. Okay, there was not ever going to be a way, absent impeachment, which by the way is still hanging out there as a possibility, to remove Trump from office on the basis of the Epstein files. All right, they're not going to do the 25th Amendment. We talked about this last week too. That requires J.D. Vance and a majority of the cabinet to tell the Congress that he's unfit to serve. That is not happening. So, one of the things that we have to keep in mind here is that the means to remove him are still the means to remove him. They're not going to change on the basis of Epstein, right? There may at some point, depending on what's disclosed next, be a growing call for his resignation, but it's not like the Epstein files, like being released, is going to instantly tank him. We have to actually set our expectations quite reasonably here. And I will point out, nonetheless, okay, that back in July, Pam Bondi said these files didn't exist. Up until the point where the Epstein Files Transparency Act was passed, within a few days, John Thune was saying he wouldn't even bring it to the floor of the Senate. So public pressure has already shown us in this situation, not just that this scandal is sticking, but also that our outcomes are unknown, okay? But all that said, if you were paying attention over Christmas, and I was trying really hard not to, Trump was losing his mind about the Epstein files on social media. Literally spent Christmas Eve and Christmas Day tweeting on Truth Social hundreds of times about how the Epstein files were a hoax and he was being set up and it was all the Democrats and people who were behind Jeffrey Epstein abandoned him, which also would seem to kind of contradict. If you're upset and empathetic toward Jeffrey Epstein, why are you claiming the whole thing is a hoax? None of it made any sense, but it's very clearly having an adverse impact on his capacity, on his mental health. Excuse me. And we'll take it, right? We'll take it. It's important to actually see that this is a process and the dominoes are falling and nobody knows exactly where it's going to end. The other thing that I just want to point out here, because I think it's relevant to this, is that I'm already seeing a lot of doomsaying about the midterms. And I just want to make something really clear to everybody about this. Again, this is something where we're going to spend a lot of 2026 talking about why it's so critical that people get involved. That's a common theme here on this channel. If you are not out there doing something right now or in your house doing something right now to try to move the needle, organize your neighbors, make your community better, you're not doing what needs to be done right now to ramp up for the midterms. So it's critical that you do that community organizing. But I also just want to say this, okay? Whether or not Trump is brought down by the Epstein files, we have a tremendous opportunity available to us in 2026, and nobody should be writing this off. One of the things that I find very difficult is that, we've just had a whole series of elections in November where we trounced them, absolutely trounced them, by double digits, sometimes in districts that Trump won. So anybody who's oh, the midterms are gone, they're going to mess with the midterms, they may try. That does not mean that everything is hopeless. And one of the things that I just want people to kind of really understand here is that the future is yet unwritten. There's going to be more No Kings rallies in 2026. We know that because Indivisible already announced it, right? There's going to be more opportunities to show up in the streets, to organize your neighbors, to work for great people who are campaigning. We have to actually stay focused and not do that thing of all hope is lost. It's really critical right now. I mean, it's going to be more critical in 2026 than it's even been in this past year. Okay. Speaking of which, I want to refer everybody to this column that Michelle Goldberg wrote in the New York Times yesterday. I posted it on Blue Sky when it came out, but it is a really critical read for anybody who's feeling downtrodden, nothing good is going to happen, all hope is lost, because it is about the fact that Trump is failing and the resistance is only getting stronger. And he is weak. He is looking weaker by the day. His policies are wildly unpopular. We had huge unexpected resistance actions and movement in 2025. Huge pushbacks against ICE when they thought we were all just going to roll over as they kidnapped our friends and neighbors. Just an incredible list of achievements. And it is really important at this point that we actually pay attention to the wins. So I want everybody to go read Michelle Goldberg's column because I do feel like it's a critical one in this era. But in addition to that, I have another thing that I wanted to mention because once again, in the comments on Patreon this morning, somebody brought up this idea that the 2020 election was stolen. And there's a couple of things that I just want to point out about this. You all have heard me talk about this at length here, all right? I just want to point something out. No matter what happened, let's just say, you all know I don't think it was stolen. I think what happened in 2020 was white supremacy. 2024 rather, sorry, not 2020, 2024. The 2024 election is what we're talking about, my bad. What happened in 2024 was white supremacy, full stop. It was people deciding to prioritize the things that Trump was telling them they needed to prioritize over their fellow human beings. That's what it was. Okay. 2024 was lost in this country because of Trump's messaging, propaganda about the need for mass deportations, an anti-immigrant platform, the idea that immigrants were stealing your jobs. It even went so far as to invade the Latino community so that people were convinced that it was only going to be criminals who were deported. That clearly is proven to be false. Okay. And so one of the things that I really need people to do here, whatever Substack you're subscribing to, whatever information is claiming that a huge percentage of people over 100 voted in a certain county in Pennsylvania, is to recognize this. Okay. It's a lot easier, particularly for white people, to believe that the election was stolen than to confront the fact that we have not done our jobs when it comes to talking to our white friends and neighbors, especially other white women, because by the way, they voted for Trump more in 2024 than they did in 2020, why they actually need to stand up for their fellow citizens, for their fellow neighbors, and for the people who are making this country run, all right? It is a lot easier to say that county in Pennsylvania was stolen. Look at this evidence that this person is speculating about on social media, than it is to actually say, I didn't do enough. I did not do my own work. I did not talk to my white girlfriends about who they were voting for. I allowed my Trumpy family members to go unaddressed at Thanksgiving dinner. Okay. This is why it's really critically important as we head into 2026 to forget about that, like to forget about the conspiracies in 2024, okay? To forget about the idea that somehow Kamala won the election and it was all taken away from us because of shenanigans through Starlink satellites or whatever nonsense people are putting out there. I have to point out something, okay? It's white supremacy, and it's literally that there were 90 million Americans who did not vote, okay? And so if you want to make sure that this doesn't happen again, that we actually take back the House so investigations and impeachment can start, so that maybe we take back the Senate so Trump's entire agenda is dead in the water. Maybe we even get enough senators in the box to remove him. You have to stop speculating about elections being stolen and start actually confronting the work that needs to be done to make sure that we win. All right? Because like, if we don't confront the errors that were undertaken in 2024, the way in which like propaganda wasn't contradicted, the ways in which we all like allowed things to slide because everybody could have done more, right? We will not actually be able to maximize on this opportunity that's coming in 2026. Okay. So I get that people are very disappointed. You all know this, was incredibly surprised and disappointed about the 2024 election. And nonetheless, okay, there is work to be done this year that will require our focus on the future and not on the past. And that's really where we actually need to kind of like direct our energy as we head into the new year. Okay. Couple other things I want to talk about here. Judge Cannon, who you all know I have very strong feelings about, has issued an order last week that will allow the release of the second volume of Jack Smith's report on February 24th of 2026, barring an appeal. This is an obvious out that she's giving to Trump to try to appeal that ruling. But nonetheless, we may finally get to see volume 2 because she is now stepping away from the case, right? Like, her determination that he was improperly appointed, she's claiming she no longer has jurisdiction. That's why the whole case was kicked in the first place. So now she's going to allow the second volume to be released in February. Who knows what's in it? We do know that Jack Smith testified, as we talked about last week, in front of a committee on the Hill. No question, he testified to this, that beyond a reasonable doubt, there was evidence that Trump had committed crimes. So we'll see what's in that second volume, which of course will pertain to fraudulent electors, January 6th, all sorts of other things. And we will see what happens with that, okay? Another interesting ruling that came out literally a week ago today was from Judge Boasberg, who of course has been overseeing the CECOT contempt case, well, the CECOT case generally. It was his order initially that was defied when they didn't turn the planes around that were going to CECOT with those 250 some odd men. Last week, he ruled without any question that the due process rights of everyone detained in CECOT were denied. They were not given an opportunity to prove that they were not gang members. This opinion in particular pertains to the 137 Venezuelan citizens who were initially denied the right to prove that they were not members of Tren de, I can never pronounce the last word on this, Tren de Agua, I believe is what it is. And that therefore now he has given them 2 weeks to comply. That means that literally everybody who was sent to CECOT, even if they are now in Venezuela, is entitled to due process for their removal from the United States. And this is going to be very interesting because he has ordered them to set up, to give them an opportunity to have a court hearing, and also to tell Judge Boasberg what their plan is to give them due process within the next 2 weeks. So this is another step in the direction of, justice. I'm very happy to see it. We'll have to see what happens next. And, again, Boasberg is on this. We're still waiting for contempt rulings. And, there's going to be more on this in the coming weeks. Okay. All right. Yesterday, Trump held a meeting with Vladimir Zelensky at Mar-a-Lago, where he made, again, some totally insane statements about Russia wanting Ukraine to succeed. The interesting thing that has come out about this meeting this morning, though, aside from the fact that it was totally off the rails and he had bruises on both hands, not just one, but both, from all that, bilateral handshaking, because, he's shaking so many hands with his left hand as well as his right. I'm joking, but, nonetheless, one of the things that came out of that meeting this morning is that Zelensky actually made a very big ask of Trump, which was that he asked Trump to guarantee Ukraine security, essentially, like a security deal for the next 30 years, basically, against Russian aggression. And Trump apparently said he would consider it. Now, all that said, they did have a call yesterday with Putin. And, Trump is still Putin's biggest fan. So, we'll have to see how this keeps going. But I do want everybody to understand that at the bare minimum, Vladimir Zelensky has shown up once again with the biggest cojones in, the Eastern Bloc. And, nonetheless is asking for what he needs. So we'll have to see what comes with that. Okay. Last thing that I just want to mention here, lots of concern. Clearly, I've already alluded to this sort of Christmas multi-posts and madness from Trump, which I desperately tried to avoid. I managed to only read 2 of them, I think. And, the kind of indicators of his mental health. I just have to say to everybody that I don't know how much more proof we need that he's failing medically and mentally. All the evidence is there. We just simply don't have the details of what exactly is going on. And at the same time, I do not expect JD Vance to do anything about it. I don't expect, the party to do anything about it. They all know that as soon as he's gone, the base will fracture even more than it has already. They know that there's not another charismatic leader who's going to be able to shore them up. Vance cannot. Everybody hates JD Vance. Also, he's weird. Walls was right. They're all really weird. It's not like Stephen Miller, who comes across as an absolute insane madman every time he's on the news, is going to be able to drum up support. He's so angry and crazy and psychopathic. Nobody wants to be around him. He's scary. And JD Vance is out there touting overt white supremacist stuff, which we all know would be real, but also nobody likes him. So I don't think there's going to be any kind of looming implosion unless and until, he really can't string a sentence together, which, by the way, may be coming sooner rather than later. We've already seen some indications of that. So I wish I had better news for the new year on that front, but, this is where we are. Okay. Final thoughts for today. And I am going to be here tomorrow, but I did just want to mention one other thing here. Okay. It is really critical. All right. That in this window of time that we have over the next week, all of us take some time to think about what our commitment is going to be in 2026 toward creating social justice and change. It's incredibly critical right now that you actually use this time to plan. And the reason why I want to say that is that, we are really into midterm season come the beginning of next week. Zohran Mamdani is being sworn in on the 1st of January in New York City. That's a huge watershed moment here on the East Coast and in my own community. But in addition to that, we are going to be really hardcore into watching what candidates are going to be running for office, who's up for re-election, what the primaries are going to look like, because there's major primary challenges to some more centrist Democrats. And those primaries are happening fast in some states. We're talking March. So it's a moment where we've really got to commit to what we're doing for the foreseeable future until next November. And it's a good time, if you do not know yet who's running for re-election where you live, right? You don't know whether or not your senator is up for re-election, to start investigating that, to understand who's running for primary purposes and who you're going to support, because it's really critical at this point that we start making plans. What are you going to commit to doing, right? How many doors are you going to knock? What campaigns are you going to volunteer for? When are you planning to phone bank? And these are things that you can start thinking about now. You can also go to mobilize.us and see what's happening for local candidates right now, because there's already fundraisers happening. There's already phone banking and text banking happening. There's awareness campaigns happening right now. So it's time to kind of like use this window of time to really think about our plan for 2026. All right. That's it for today, my friends. I'm going to try to relax this week because I didn't last week, but I will be back here tomorrow at regular time, and then we will be off for the rest of the week. I want to thank everybody who's already sent me some holiday cheer over the Venmo and the Cash App, which are scrolling across the bottom of the screen. I greatly appreciate you guys. It's so appreciated here just to have that little extra holiday gifty. And so thank you to everybody who contributed. I really tried to like heart every single one of you who sent me a few extra bucks. And I'm just grateful for all of you who have done that. It does really make a difference also for me and for our staff. So we will be back tomorrow and then off for the rest of the week. Also, for those of you who follow us at the Ripple Effect Institute channel, there is no new video today because our whole team is off. Everybody's away, including our video editor. So we will have a new video next Monday on 5 things you can do to fight Trump in 2026. So stay tuned for that. But I will be back here tomorrow. And in the meantime, I hope you're all doing well and getting more rest than I am. All right, you guys, I'll see you tomorrow. Take care. Bye. That's our show for today, folks. Thanks so much for being here at Resistance Live. To get more out of the show, including bonus broadcasts, the answers to all your most pressing political and legal questions, and way more, head on over to patreon.com/resistancelive and become a paid subscriber. And don't forget to hit subscribe here on your favorite podcasting platform to make sure that you never miss an episode. See you next time.